Okay, welcome everyone. We would like to be respectful of everyone's time. Good afternoon and welcome to ARC's Literacy Webinar Series. I'm Amelia Larson and I serve as the Executive Vice President of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. ARC is an organization founded by and run by educators in pursuit of love, literacy, and liberty. Our work is designed to create the types of schools where all students are served well and thrive. We draw specific attention to the needs of students from historically marginalized and underserved groups by creating a sense of belonging and safety and engaging them in high levels of literacy work that honors their intellect, culture, and communities. A few housekeeping items. Closed captioning has been enabled for those who would like a live transcript. We are recording today's session and hope to share it with all of you. You will receive an email in a few days with resources from this webinar, as well as information about our upcoming webinars. We have an incredible lineup, as you can see it from today. I do encourage you to join the conversation through the chat feature. If you have questions, continue to post them in the chat and we'll try to address them as we go. Now, without further interruption, I would like to introduce you to today's speakers and esteemed board members. Dr. Jim Cummins is a professor emeritus with the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, Canada. His research focuses on literacy development in educational contexts characterized by linguistic and socioeconomic diversity. Dr. Alfred Tatum is the provost and executive vice president for Academic Affairs at Metropolitan State University of Denver. His research and advocacy are aimed at advancing the literacy development of African American boys in the United States, and I would say the world. I speak for everyone at ARC when I say we are delighted to have you join today's conversation. Escaping the trap of basic, moving toward advanced literacy. If you think about it, being able to read and write well opens doors. Reading is rich, but also complicated, an intricate mix of various habits, skills, confidence, and knowledge. The other skills of speaking, listening, writing, and facility with language add to and strengthen the threads of this rich tapestry. But conventional models of classroom-based instruction are not meeting the needs of vast amounts of students, particularly those frequently at the margins of design considerations and resource allocations. During the past couple of years, vital questions about how to ensure all school-age children learn to read and write well and with confidence have gained even greater urgency. It is in this environment that is ripe for new opportunities to reset how we do things to make literacy instruction more responsive and effective that we will hear from our guests today. So I'm going to start by asking both Jim and Alfred, what do you bring to this conversation and what do you think is missing from the conversation, from the dialogue that is going on in the country right now? I'll start with you, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Amelia. And let me personally welcome everybody who's part of this webinar. I'm delighted to be here and to have the chance to engage in dialogue with you about some of the issues that are important to all of us. The work that I've been doing has focused primarily on multilingual students, students who are sometimes called emergent bilingual or English learners, English language learners, who are learning the language of schooling, the language of instruction, as they are also trying to acquire academic content. And I guess the major perspective that I would bring to this webinar is the fact that if we focus only on language issues, then we're missing the big picture, because we've got to step back and ask ourselves, well, who are the groups of students or the categories of students who tend to experience disproportionate academic underachievement, not just in the United States, but internationally. And when you do that, three groups of students come out from the research. And I'm excluding here students who have special needs, which is an individual issue. But the three groups are students who are learning the school language as an additional language. But there are also students who are growing up in poverty, students from low-income backgrounds or low socioeconomic backgrounds, who experience a variety of opportunity gaps that are not necessarily directly related to language. And then thirdly, there are students from communities that have experienced discrimination, exclusion, racism, often over generations. If we look at Native American students, African American students, many groups of Latino students over the years, we see underachievement that is related to patterns of discrimination in the wider society. And so if we look at what are the causal factors, or what researchers have begun to call opportunity gaps that affect each of these three groups of students, then we could ask ourselves, well, what kinds of research or what kinds of instructional interventions are likely to address these opportunity gaps? So as an example, if we look at students from non-English speaking backgrounds, one of the clear opportunity gaps and potential causes of underachievement is the fact that these students are coming to school with minimal or very limited knowledge of the school language. So if the school doesn't act effectively to help students bridge that gap and help them acquire the school language, then these students are going to fall further behind. And so we can ask ourselves, what are the evidence-based instructional interventions that can be effective in addressing not just linguistic differences, but also differences associated with social and economic patterns in the wider society, and also issues related to marginalization and racism in the wider society. And basically, we've got to put all three of these together to create whole school policies that will be effective. And I'll elaborate on some of these issues as we go through the webinar.
Thank you so much. And design is what comes to my mind, right? It cannot be just little boxes as an afterthought, but it's an a priori design that expands and does not suppress. But Dr. Tatum, same thing. How are you showing up today? What are you bringing to this conversation?
Hello, everyone. I'm going to answer this question, but I put together 10 slides to really capture how I interrogate or bring a sense of interrogation, namely how we think about what we're missing and how we're missing the mark. And so I'll go through these very quickly because I'm most interested in having a conversation with Jim here today. Now, prior to this webinar, I did something very interesting. I just talked to 10 students, and I said, asked the question, why are some metals in the body safe while others are lethal? And then why should kids eat vitamins? Now, this may seem like a basic question, but there are many folks who could read every single word that we have here. So they have decoding, they have language acquisition. But many of the students across the academic and the economic continuum did not know that we had metals in our bodies. This is an oversight. And so many of them had to study the periodic table, but they never really connected it to biology, with the exception of H2O. So the question I always ask is, what are we gaining when we focus on the engines of reading, decoding, language acquisition, fluency, and vocabulary? But then what do we surrender when we only focus on the engine of reading? And so there are three metals that are good for the body and there are multiple metals that are poisonous. And then folks were trying to figure out, well, why don't these metals go off in a metal detector? And so this just expands the conversation in a way. And I share this because we can focus on reading while postponing intellectual development, postponing academic development. I'm really interrogating two forms of aggression. In this nation and in Canada, there is aggression toward basic and proficient reading, math, and science. And then you also have this know your place disciplinary aggression. There are some disciplines we just don't teach to young folks. And this leads to both intellectual erasure and academic and disciplinary erasure. For example, I wrote a quick note that we still have some communities in the US that have never produced a neuroscientist or geneticist, an architect or professor. However, it is still taboo to discuss advanced reading and writing in most school districts in the US and Canada. That's an awful form of aggression. In physics, for example, they always put together these crude diagrams. So I did the same here to try to capture this. The nation has authorized underperformance and sort of tricked our minds into focusing on proficient as the marker of success. But you need a different type of momentum and velocity, particularly when you try to move students toward advanced reading and writing across the disciplines. And so how do we push this disciplinary block along this continuum while we're also moving toward advanced levels of reading and writing? Sadly, we have students who have strong linguistic skills, strong requisite reading and writing skills, but somehow they're still underserved by the schools. Very interestingly, I began to ask the question, interrogations, how do we read text from advanced interdisciplinary literacy lenses? Now, we don't have a lot of this information in brain-based science, although we talk about brain-based research, but there's nothing that really helps us fully understand what disciplines students pay attention to while they're reading a particular piece of text. I'll give you an example. When you read the Iliad, for example, you can read it from 5 different disciplinary lenses at a minimum, and I captured this. And so I began to, from a curricular perspective, ask the question, how do we think about teaching text and teaching skills that combat disciplinary erasure, particularly when all of these disciplines serve as a tool of protection? The greatest form of equity for me is disciplinary equity, because this is what communities use to protect themselves, protect their cultures, and protect their posterity. So you can read the Iliad from none of these lenses, or you can read it from all of these lenses while still paying attention to the engines of reading, decoding, fluency, and vocabulary. I want to give you an example. When I read the Iliad recently, I reread it, I read it from a biochemistry perspective. This means when I'm teaching this particular text, I have to teach from a literary perspective, but complement it with biochemistry. Let's pay attention to what's in the red only. On page 93, for example, I saw this word akavito, and it's about poisons. And then I see this word noxious drool. When I first read the Iliad, I never paid attention to this because I wasn't reading it from a biochemistry perspective. And I didn't realize that this was mainly about poisons. And then this immediately poisonous aconite plant. Aconite is an alkaloid. This is the same alkaloid that you find in Alka-Seltzer. And so when I think about the roles of literacy and text, I think about it from an expansive perspective. And when I share this with young folks, they began to say, wait a minute, I never even thought about Alka-Seltzer as an intentional poison, but then this led us to plant biology. And so you begin to have an outgrowth of text. But what happens if we look at reading and writing from a basic or proficient perspective, you begin to surrender all of this disciplinary knowledge across multiple texts and across multiple disciplines. This requires a different type of reorientation. And this is the work that I've been doing with third, fourth, and fifth grade boys using what I refer to as a multi-dimensional reading model. And this goes back to, why am I trying to create mass and velocity and momentum with the text? Because this is one way that we move beyond the national authorization that says basic and proficient, ignoring the disciplines, while I try to pay attention to a different estimation of achievement that looks at advanced levels, and making sure that three things happen. You have reading and writing development, you have academic development across the disciplines, and you also have personal development, with the hope that we reconceptualize reading, writing, and intellectual development to combat disciplinary erasure in the nation.
Wow. A drop the mic moment. Jim, do you have any questions, anything you want to say? I have some things in my head that are just like, my head is exploding right now.
One of the things that was going through my mind as Alfred was talking is that it speaks to the recommendation, to the advocacy of a lot of researchers that we should be teaching language and academic language across the curriculum. So, for example, at the middle school or high school level, a teacher of science or teacher of history should also see themselves as a teacher of language, the language of science, the disciplinary language of history and mathematics and other subjects. And that happens, I think, to an increasing extent at the elementary level, where you've got the same teacher teaching different subject areas. And so it's easier to do. It's a real uphill challenge at the high school level very often, but it's I think even more important to do it. And what Alfred has just talked about has certainly given me a new perspective on that particular issue.
And when we talk about the responsibility of the people that design units and curate libraries for the classroom, choose core texts, that if we have this vision of disciplinary literacy from multiple perspectives, we don't leave that to chance, right? Because we bring the right texts that will do the heavy lifting for the teachers to do the kinds of things that Alfred's talking about. So when I think about the conversations that are going on currently in our country, and especially like what the science of reading is. So the science of reading can mean so many things to so many people. Being with what you talked about just now, what is the science of reading to you? And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Tatum. And what should people be asking?
I'll start here. I think there has to be a firm recognition that the science of reading is unsettled, because there's just a lot we don't know, and we connect it to brain-based policies, practices for conducting reading. As I just illustrated, I see the science of reading as the engine. If you had an aircraft with an engine only, it doesn't have the propulsion to take flight. It doesn't have the wings to remain steady. There are multiple other components that you have to add to that engine. And I think if we poorly conceptualize the benefits and the affordances of the science of reading, it's going to work to the detriment of those who read well and those who do not read well, because you just miss out on too much. And that's what I was trying to capture very briefly. So, for example, the science of reading would not dictate, and I use the Iliad as one example, but we have not studied. When I first read that, I read it from a legal perspective. There was a murder. And this time I read it from a biochemistry perspective. But I can also read it from an evolutionary biological perspective. That's all brain-based. That's all science. But we're studying what we know. We have to begin to study what has been underserved, overlooked and working to the disadvantage of a large number of students across the universe.
Thank you, Jim. Same thing to you. What is the science of reading to you, and what do you want people to start asking?
Well, obviously, when we talk about the science of reading, I don't think anybody would want to say that we want to base reading instruction on non-scientific perspectives. So there's no way you can be against the science of reading in the abstract. What is problematic is when the science of reading or people who invoke the science of reading leave out a lot of the actual scientific data. And I think, unfortunately, that's what's happening in practice and in implementation right now in an increasing number of jurisdictions. When I look at the data, I see two things that are fundamentally important. One of which we've talked a lot about over the past 50 years and beyond that, and that's the importance of teaching foundational skills, teaching phonics, phonemic awareness, making sure that students know and develop the ability to connect up the sounds of the language with the written language. I don't know anybody at this point who argues against the teaching of phonics. What they do express concern about is when, say, 60 minutes a day is focused on what's often one-size-fits-all phonics that doesn't connect instruction to students' background, doesn't focus on getting students engaged with literacy, and typically may be successful in developing basic decoding skills, but then when students get to grade 3 or grade 4, they hit what's been called the grade 4 slump, where their comprehension scores drop dramatically because they haven't had the language development and the exposure to reading that's required to fuel reading comprehension. When we look at the data, and this is particularly important for kids coming from low-income backgrounds, I mentioned that this is one of the categories of students that tend across the world to experience lower than desirable academic achievement. There's not a lot that schools can do directly to address some of the opportunity gaps. For example, teachers in the classroom can't do very much about overcrowding in students' homes, where there isn't even table space for students to do homework. But one of the things that they can do a lot about, and it's totally within the control of schools, is to address one of the realities of growing up in a poverty context where families are struggling to put food on the table. And that's the fact that families who are on the verge of poverty or living in poverty typically don't have the money to buy books for the kids. They don't have the money to buy iPhones and tablets for the kids. And students come to school often with a gap in terms of their exposure to literacy in the home, what I would call literacy socialization. There may be a lot of rich cultural activities going on in the home. That may or may not be there depending on the context. But typically, when we look at kids from low-income backgrounds compared to kids from more affluent backgrounds, there's about a 4-year literacy socialization gap where kids who are coming from middle-class backgrounds have been read to from the time they're toddlers, they're exposed to books, they're gaining insights about how print works, and they come to school primed to develop decoding skills. That's not necessarily the case for kids who are coming from lower-income backgrounds. And then what the research of people like Nell Duke has demonstrated is that often kids coming from lower-income backgrounds come to school where they're even more cut off from actual exposure to books, where they get a focus on phonics in isolation from real connection and real exposure to what makes us want to read. And the data are really clear that in addition to teaching foundational skills, and as I said, I have no problems with teaching phonics explicitly, but we need to differentiate that depending on who's in our classroom. But we also need to take account of the fact that there's a huge amount of research data showing that print access and enabling students to get actively involved and engaged with literacy is a powerful predictor, powerful determinant of how well students are going to develop reading comprehension skills. And this virtually never gets mentioned by advocates of the science of reading. And so we need to put the two sides of the coin together. We teach foundational skills, but at the same time, we focus on developing students' language development, their vocabulary, their knowledge of how the language of books, the language of academic texts is put together. And this means connecting instruction to students' lives, making sure that the texts that we provide access to are culturally relevant to them, are of high interest, that they want to read, that they can get engaged with. And the best way, probably the most powerful way of expanding students' knowledge of vocabulary, knowledge of language, is reading to them. Having read alouds where we get students excited about the story, where we get them to develop the beginnings of reading skills, reading strategies, where we might stop in the middle of the story and say, what do you think is going to happen next? This might be happening with 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. We're teaching the reading strategy of prediction long before students have got engaged with decoding. And we're also explaining vocabulary. We're looking at the pictures in the book and explaining vocabulary. This is a powerful way of expanding students' academic language development and also giving them the motivation, the fuel to want to read, to get engaged with reading. So teaching foundational skills is going to be far more effective when it's done in the context of a focus on ensuring that students have access to print. Schools and classrooms have classroom libraries where students can bring books home to read with their parents or older siblings or grandparents or whoever might be there, and where we develop a community of learners focused on the enjoyment and the love of reading. And that we need to put that in there because that's the other side of the coin that's been totally neglected.
And I think if you keep in mind the disciplinary literacy, that we cannot wait for it, right? So there is no
Absolutely.
such thing as learning to read without reading to learn, even if they are being read to. In our kindergarten classes, we teach reading and knowledge building through science topics. So in kindergarten, they go through 4 units. Do you want to be a scientist? Then zoology, ecology, and entomology. And I was visiting classrooms, kindergarten classrooms at the end of the year, and I saw the ownership of the projects in the vocabulary, in the drawings. But it's what, Dr. Tatum, you were talking about it. When you expose them, it becomes theirs, and they start putting things together and questioning and using words. So we have kindergartners using words such as butterfly patterns and etc. But so with this movement, and I don't know, Dr. Tatum or Dr. Cummins, if you have a question for each other, otherwise I have a question for the two of you.
Well, I just wanted to respond to what Jim said. I mean, there was so much power that was offered. I'm going to pick up on the thread of literacy, socialization gap. That gap is one of the major reasons why it's taboo to talk about advanced levels. There's a sense of wanting to be kind and responsive to students across the academic continuum. And so what we have a reading a hierarchy of sorts of who deserves certain types of text or certain types of instruction. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, it happens. And what happens, while the data are clear, the data are now becoming permanent if we don't reconceptualize how it moves forward. And then particularly around issues of relevance. Much of what we talk about when we're talking about students of color, we primarily talk about sociological relevance, more so than scientific relevance, because that requires that we have a broader knowledge of a wide range of text. I had a student who had a dry cough. He was a high school student. Going back to the diagrams that I shared with him, and we read botany together and discovered something called slippery elm. It's found in a tea called throat coat, right? That was absolutely relevant for him. So it was botany. It was about the medicinal qualities in tea. But if we're looking at identity in a particular type of way, we have a delta between sociological relevance and scientific relevance. The same thing with why should kids eat vitamins or adults eat vitamins. We were studying the thyroid disease, and that's connected to iron deficiency. And so this is why some metals inside the body are better than others. And so how do we think about literacy, socialization, and relevance and interrogate it in a way that we have a greater balance between sociological relevance and scientific relevance? And it also suggests if there is this gap, there may be a need to put more text in front of students in responsive ways as compared to less text, because we become inadvertent accomplices to the data that are becoming permanent. And so that's what I thought about as Jim was making his remarks, going back to how do we start interrogating stuff differently, and what do we need to become smart about? We absolutely need to become smart about teaching language, teaching decoding, phonics, and phonemic awareness. But the other things we need to become smart about often remain invisible, and this leads to an underexposure to students across the economic and the academic continuum.
Jim, anything you want to add?
Yeah, one of the things that comes to my mind again is, as Alfred is talking about disciplinary literacies, is research data from a number of sources at the high school level with English learners, where the focus has been on teaching students the language. So they get a lot of English as a second language instruction, but they don't get into the kind of courses that they require in order to go to college. They don't get into college placement courses because it's felt that, well, they don't have the language skills in English to succeed in these courses. And this is an example of an opportunity gap created by misconceptions on the part of the school. One of the misconceptions is that students, because they don't know English very much at this point, or they're beginners or intermediate students in English, that they can't succeed in learning biology or learning other scientific area disciplines. What we forget is the need for the school and the educators who are teaching those subjects to make them accessible for students. Mm-hmm. And this is how students not only acquire the credits that they need in subjects that are going to get them into college, but it's also how they expand their academic literacy, as Alfred has really clearly pointed out. And so we need to focus on whole school strategies where we interrogate, we look at our own assumptions and mm-hmm. ask ourselves, to what extent do our assumptions, even though they may be well-intentioned, do they exclude students from the kind of advancement and the kind of access to disciplinary literacies that they need to succeed beyond the basic level? Mm-hmm. And so, that involves not just English as an additional language or second language teachers talking about it. It involves the science teacher, the math teacher. And it means that school leaders at all levels, elementary, middle school, and high school, need to have a knowledge of what exactly is required instructionally and organizationally to enable students to succeed at their maximum level or at their maximum pace. So, this is not something where you can pull a manual off a shelf and get the instant solutions to the problems. The problems are there are issues that need to be discussed at the school level, where we bring an awareness of relevant research, we bring an awareness of what succeeded in our school context and in other school contexts, and we chart directions that will be effective in enabling all students to succeed. And this means that if we're talking about, say, students from communities that have been marginalized socially and educationally over generations, all of the factors, the stereotypes that are operating in the wider society, the teacher expectations, low teacher expectations that have been characteristic of educational provision over generations, all of these things add up to a process of identity devaluation. But if identity devaluation is operating as an opportunity gap, as a causal factor, it's very clear that as educators, we need to focus on instructional approaches that affirm students' identities, that expand their identities, that enable students to see themselves, in the case of English learners, not just as learners of English, but as bilingual, bicultural, multilingual students who see themselves as capable of strong, powerful academic work, and who are using language powerfully to expand their identities, and express and share their intellectual activities. So these are the issues that we need to look at within our schools, where the image of the student is a core element in terms of how we look at our own instruction. If we assume that because emergent bilingual students can't really get involved in inquiry or can't really get involved in creative intellectual work because, well, their English is only intermediate at this point, we are creating a barrier. And so we need to look at these issues, talk about them, and figure out what directions we need to go in to ensure that all students can develop powerful intellectual abilities and powerful language abilities.
And I want to make sure I rephrase this a little bit, because so often we look at policies that separate, that pull kids out, that hold them back, instead of bringing language and literacy together and making sure that kids do things with language within the disciplines, no matter where they are. So every day they have to do something. Is that what you're saying, Jim?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so in terms of that, we typically have these one size fits all brushes, these policies that seem so easy and simple on paper. Given the diversity and the complexity of student experiences when they enter school, we all know that no one size fits all will work. So if you were king for a day, both of you, and you had the year of Washington in states to set up key policies to get different results, what would you focus on?
Alfred, you can be king first.
Oh, king for a day.
Just for a day.
I have a crown in my office. I'm going to go put it on.
Okay.
You know what, Amelia, I'm going to push back on that question just a little bit.
Okay.
Because in my assessment, every time something gets legislated, it leads to mediocrity. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, it just happens that way, whether it's at the local level, the national level, or the state level, because the metrics are very different. The metrics are ones that we could be satisfied with, but they never help us reimagine where we could go as a particular nation. But what I would say, and this really connects to the science of reading, I think there are a couple of things that are part of a grander literacy equation: language acquisition, foundational skills, et cetera. We have to have that as part of any initiative moving forward. But there's this book called The God's Equation by Michio Kaku. And in that book, he said, even though we have the right equation to make something happen, we always have to examine where the beauty and the harmony lies. And so as Jim was talking about earlier about the identity of readers, how it can be devalued, we have to make sure there's beauty and harmony that complements the foundational language acquisition things that are absolutely necessary. And it's finding a way to complement those things. The beauty and the harmony usually lies within the interaction of the teacher. It usually lies within the frame of the text. And it usually lies when we focus on personal development and academic development, while also making sure we do not neglect skill development.
Okay, you can be king for more than a day.
I'm turning it over. I'm surrendering my crown to Jim now.
What a great answer, Jim.
Okay, I'm kind of modest. I'll take being a king for 5 minutes. Okay. When you raised that question, Amelia, what came to my mind was the question that I think educators, teachers ask themselves on a regular basis, like, what am I doing in the classroom? Translating that as, who am I as an educator? Who do I want to be as an educator? And I think that's a really important question to ask, because when we look at what's happening in the classroom, there's a process of negotiation of identities. The interactions between teachers and students are not just communicating to the students who the teacher sees them as being right now, but also who they can be. but also teachers' identities are in flux as they work with their students. And I think if you were to ask that question to many new teachers, they would say they want to be the kind of educator who enables students to expand their minds, to become knowledgeable about content, highly literate, but also people who can make a positive difference in their societies. Yeah. And so when we look at this process of negotiation of identities, I think starting with the teacher in terms of who do I want to be as an educator? What do I want my time in the classroom over the next 20 years, 30 years, or however long it might be to achieve? And I think most teachers do not want to be just a transmitter of static curriculum to students, where they may get students up to that basic level or even proficient level that Alfred was talking about, but they don't get students necessarily who are active inquirers, who see themselves as people who are capable of intellectual achievement. And there was a quotation that I reproduced on the cover of a book I wrote that was published by the California Association for Bilingual Education a number of years ago, called Negotiating Identities, Education for Empowerment in a Diverse Society. And this was a quotation from two high school students, Rosalba and Adriana Yasso. And they were in a class taught by a teacher called Bill Terrasas. And one of the things that they said in a chapter that they wrote in a book focused on critical pedagogies that the CABE, the California Association for Bilingual Education, published in the mid 90s. They said, we had a teacher who believed in us. He didn't try to hide our power, he advertised it. And I think that is a very succinct and, no pun intended, powerful perspective on what should be happening in the classroom. And when we look at the word empower or empowerment, it's sort of been degraded because every corporation says it wants to empower its workers by having them work harder for less pay. But I think it's important to hang on to that notion, because power is being negotiated in our societies all the time, in our schools. Open up any newspaper, any article about education, you see this. And so the way that I've tried to define the notion of empowerment is that empowerment can be defined as the collaborative creation of power, where the more power, the more intellectual power, the more personal power, the more literary power, creative power that students are developing in the context of their education, the more empowered the teacher herself or himself becomes. And so it's an additive process. The other definition of power that you'll find in dictionaries is the notion of having power over somebody else, exercising your power over somebody else. But the notion of empowerment picks up on the notion of gaining power, gaining the power to control your own lives, to go in a direction that you want to go in. And so creating classroom interactions and classroom curricula that enable teachers to see their role as participants in an empowerment process, I think, is something that is a powerful way of beginning a discussion within the school about who do we want to be as educators.
And I think the piece here is like investigating your pedagogical orientation, right? Because information transmission is kind of like an oppressive power over versus what you are describing that is more like a cognitive apprenticeship. So when you think about where we are in the conversations that are going on right now, there's also what counts as evidence, what counts as science, and who decides that. If you had an ask for researchers that are designing questions, designing studies, making decisions about what to do next, what would you ask them? There's a paucity of studies on teaching literacy skills to Black, Brown, linguistically diverse. So what would you want them to be considering right now?
You know, I'll tell you one of the challenges that I have when I really try to analyze the existing research. It's and I'm talking about large scale studies and small scale studies. Um, what we're trying to accomplish in reading is not always clear to me. Sometimes it's based on personal preferences or interest or our own ways of entering the world. And we have to make a lot of assumptions and leaps across multiple bodies of research. And I think if we find a way to um, enter the research with critical eyes and fresh eyes, that allows us to um, propose, authorize, or legislate things with a greater degree of integrity, that's going to serve the nation well. In my own work, for example, I hear a lot of things about teaching reading to Black boys. But when I examine the research, I mean, it's absent in southern regions of the US, the western regions of the US, and many of these are small scale qualitative studies. But we're making assumptions that are effectively impacting students' lives in consequential ways for that. And until we have a more robust research agenda um, that gives us greater confidence in the results, um, we're going to continue to have good things happen, but at the same time, we're going to miss the mark. I'm not saying the research is bad; it leads us in a positive direction, but also, I think we need to expand the field of researchers. It's a narrow pool of those who continue to provide the results, and sometimes they can be at a distance to those who are actually doing the work. Um, so those are things that I'm wrestling with my own research and my interpretation of, and the positive research in so many areas.
Okay. When we look at the scientific evidence that's been brought to bear in discussions of reading instruction in the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom and elsewhere, what policymakers have listened to predominantly is research coming from a cognitive psychology perspective. And there's nothing wrong with cognitive psychology. It's one important disciplinary perspective in what's happening in students' minds as they learn and instructionally, but it's not the only perspective. And so when we look at those three categories of students that tend, on average, to experience disproportionate underachievement, you've got a real disciplinary gap in terms of who focuses on each of these categories. When we look at students who are learning the school language, it's predominantly linguists and applied linguists who focus on how do we teach English as a second or additional language effectively? What kind of linguistic progression should we expect? When we look at students from low socioeconomic backgrounds or low income backgrounds and look at the effects of various kinds of social disadvantage, it's a whole other set of researchers who've focused on this. They tend maybe to be sociologists and have a broader social perspective. People like Dave Berliner and various others have done wonderful work here. But often they don't focus on what are the linguistic issues involved. They don't focus on how do we teach reading. And then when we look at the third category, students who are coming from communities that have been marginalized and experience racism currently and often over many generations, we tend to have folks who are looking at the issues from a critical lens. They may be sociologists, they may be linguists in some respects, but they're looking at issues related to the effects of discrimination, racism, and how do we implement culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogies, all of which is fine. But these three groups don't typically talk to each other. And so when you look at reading instruction, you get predominantly a cognitive psychology perspective being picked up by policymakers, and the broader social issues are not really considered. And so when we look at the research on reading, there's one side of the coin is how do we teach foundational skills? And we know that ensuring that all students develop the knowledge of sound symbol relationships is important. You can't get very far if you can't decode. And so teaching phonics is certainly one part of the equation, but it's not the whole story. And when you look at the other side of the coin, you see a huge amount of research that has been largely ignored, focusing on the causal role of print access in terms of students' development of reading skills. The work of people like John Guthrie and others has highlighted that reading engagement, or more broadly literacy engagement, is a key causal factor in terms of students' development of strong reading skills. So if we're going to be scientific, we need to look at all the data. When we look at issues related to creating culturally sustaining classrooms, okay, language issues are important there. And often the folks who've done really good work in terms of culturally relevant, culturally sustaining pedagogies have not really looked at language issues, have not really looked at reading issues. We need to put these together and ask, okay, how do we build literacy skills and develop students' academic language knowledge and their power in using language effectively in contexts where racism is still an issue in terms of a block to students' engagement. And that means looking at, well, how can we teach literacy in a way that affirms students' identities? One way of doing this is to ensure that students have opportunities to work either individually or in groups to create what I've called identity texts, where they produce content. It may be multimodal content, it may be PowerPoints, it may be videos, it may be essays or writing that they've done or scientific inquiry, but they produce this content that is the work of their own creativity, obviously with the support of teachers. And then it's out there in the world for sharing. And once that's out there and shared with a large number of people, it holds a mirror up to students in which their identities are reflected back in a positive light. And this fuels further engagement. One of the examples that educators that I've worked with and in a variety of contexts have done is have students create dual language books or texts where they create these stories that may be from their own experience, that may be relating to other academic work they've done across the curriculum. We put these up on the web. They're read by thousands of people, and they showcase students' ability and competence to become bilingual, biliterate, and to showcase what they can do in those two languages, as well as showcasing their creativity, showcasing their literacy skills. And this is all feeding back into affirming students' identities. So this is part of the research, but often because it's not statistical research, when we talk about issues like identity, how do you quantify identity? It gets ignored. But the research is out there, it's powerful, and it's inspirational for teachers.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. And I am going to turn to see if we have any questions in the chat. This has been so wonderful. Any questions? I'll wait until we hear from folks, but I want to turn to both of you. We covered a lot of ground. What is left unsaid? What is one thing that you really want to communicate to educators, policymakers, parents, students? What's left unsaid? Dr. Tatum?
You know, one of the things that we really didn't talk about much here, tangentially, we touched it, but the roles of writing. You know, I think that gives a different type of capturing. I see writing also as a tool of protection. And if we're trying to write, that also requires, similar to our conversations, we've gone across a lot of topics, whether it's legislation or research or reading or pedagogy. These are the same type of affordances students need to have access to. And we really, although I talk about advanced literacy, we want to make it difficult for students to fail in our presence. So as Jim was talking earlier, that reminded me of my first year of teaching. I always ask the question, what am I missing? What do I need to become smarter about? I did not or never assumed that I had all of the information that I needed, and I still don't today. But having that notion that reading and writing and language development and intellectual development could destroy anything that goes across against our humanity, that allows me to remain steadfast. And I think every teacher or educator needs to find that thing that allows their students to understand that they are on their side.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll
Jim?
just I'll add an addendum to what Alfred just said and highlight the role of poetry and having students write poetry in their classrooms. Poetry is kind of interesting because many of us see it as being difficult. Well, we read a poem, we may not quite understand what it's saying, but with poetry, students can say a lot with a few words. So if we're talking about students who are in the process of learning English, with a few words, they can say quite a lot. They can write in their first language also. They can produce poems on topics that are relevant to them and share this. And the work of people like Alma Florada, going back 20, 30 years, has highlighted just how powerful for bilingual, multilingual communities, writing poetry that reflect a students' life experiences or aspirations can be in the classroom. And this is one form of identity text that I think is probably neglected to a considerable extent, but it can be a really powerful stepping stone to more advanced forms of literacy for many students.
Thank you. We did get some questions as we are running out of time, and I'm going to send you these questions so you can have input into it. But Dr. Tatum, there's a question here that says, can you discuss the concept of scientific justice and how it relates to social justice?
Social justice, because of national movements and the trauma vortex in society, was getting a lot of attention. But I think we were ignoring how science is equally powerful in society. It's a more difficult conversation. Fewer people are entering into the conversation about scientific justice. And so if we're talking about water shortages or diabetes or whatever the case may be, we need to nurture the next generation who have the capacity to protect their communities for that. Pharmacology. I said there are some communities that don't have neuroscientists, and we talk about the brain and the power of the brain. We need a greater balance in society, and that is something that we should consider when we make curricular decisions. Jim talked a lot about identity development. Oftentimes when I share an example of a student's writing and say, what type of text should I put in front of them? It's oftentimes a sociological text, how they're thinking about identity, but they're not thinking about it from a science text. So I start asking, well, what type of physics text should we put in front of the student? Because you are the universe, and there's a lot of information involved in that. And we just haven't given enough attention to scientific justice. And that's what I think leads to erasure across the disciplines by the time a lot of students get to higher education.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are going to keep the additional questions. We'll get answers back to you. But I want to thank you. I want to thank our speakers. What a great way to spend this hour. And I hope you join our next two webinars. We have Jim back with Claude next month, and they are going to continue this conversation around best practices and pursuing clarity around the science of reading debate. And then we have later on in the month, can we show the next one? Connecting research to practice, making science of movement, science of reading more than a movement, where we have David Lieben and Sarah Lupo continuing to expand on this topic. Thank you again. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time. Jim, Alfred, what a joy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being a part of our family.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Bye, Alfred. Take care.